Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States. Episode 4.41, Fort Washington. The fall of 1776 was among the most difficult times in the entire war. Although politically, the year would bring about the most defining moment of the war, the Declaration of Independence. On the battlefield, it had been a disaster. Sure, there were moments when things seemed to be going a bit better. The Americans had taken Boston in the early spring. They had defended Sullivan's Island in South Carolina. And then they had won a much-needed skirmish at Harlem Heights, which we talked about at the end of our last episode. However, these moments provided little more than temporary morale boosts. Even in the case of Boston, which on its face does seem like a major victory, General Howe had no intention of remaining in the city forever. Despite some stalling on his part, the plan had always been for him to abandon Boston. The other American victories proved little more than a temporary respite, rather than accomplishing any long-term strategic ends. The Americans had been pushed out of Canada to the north. They had been forced from Long Island and then from New York City. George Washington had some very serious problems on his hands. He was dealing with an army and an officer corps that was proving woefully inadequate for the fight ahead. More than once, he found himself lamenting the lack of discipline in his army and their seeming unwillingness to stand their ground and fight. At the same time, he was also dealing with an army that was at constant risk of disintegration, as enlistments were set to expire en masse at the end of the year, and as men often just wandered off, never to return. Following the loss of Long Island, the entire war itself had changed. The popular consensus became that the revolution would become a war of posts. The Americans recognized that they would seldom match the British in the field. However, if they could make those British victories exceedingly expensive, they just might be able to outlast the British resolve to fight. In other words, every battle should be turned into a Bunker Hill. Sure, they might lose every single battle, but if they won the war, well, that was all that really mattered. This week we are going to pick up right where we left off last time. The Americans are still holding a position on the northern portion of Manhattan and would spend the fall doing anything they could to staunch the bleeding from the previous summer. Although Harlem Heights was more of a skirmish than it was a decisive battle, the American victory there did buy them a brief respite from the British. Both sides took a moment to catch their breath and perform a degree of reorganization. The Continental Army was reeling from multiple losses and were being steadily pushed back, as they now found themselves at risk of being forced from Manhattan altogether. The British, having just landed, needed to secure their spoils, and then, of course, would have to deal with a fire that destroyed over a fifth of the city. Part of the problem for Washington was that he really did not know what Howe was planning to do next. William Howe had two very viable options available to him. He could have continued along the Hudson and worked towards that plan of cutting New England off from the rest of the country. In Canada, the Americans were quickly being pushed further and further to the south. There was a real possibility that Howe's army could potentially join with Burgoyne's, resulting in New England's isolation. Alternatively, Howe could cross the Hudson and invade New Jersey. From there, his army could potentially march south towards the capital in Philadelphia. Should Washington decide to act too soon, he could potentially expose one of those two fronts to Howe and effectively make his decision for him. On October 12th, Howe would end up dictating events when he landed some 4,000 men, more or less unopposed, on Throg's Neck, located in the modern-day Bronx along the East River. Howe's reason for the landing along Throg's Neck was clear. His position there gave him an opportunity to sweep towards Manhattan and trap the American army on the island. This was enough for Washington to decide that he needed to pull back further, and he began the process of relocating his army to the north, to White Plains. What ensued was a cat-and-mouse chase between Washington and Howe. Upon learning that Washington was pulling to the north, Howe quickly relocated his army to Pell's Point, further to the north. Upon arriving at White Plains, Washington took up a position with a line moving from west to east. One side was anchored by the Bronx River, with the west side featuring a hill for the Americans to dig in on. This was really exactly the position the Americans had wanted to find themselves in when they decided that they were going to fight a war of posts. Washington held good positioning, and although he was significantly outnumbered by Howe's army, he was in a place where he could at least make a victory expensive. Washington could never hold White Plains, and really that was never the point. The point was to make the British pay a steep price in capturing it. General Howe seemingly understood this as well, and as a result was very slow to throw his men into a repeat of Bunker Hill. Howe did not want to repeat that disaster from the previous year, and yet again showed little enthusiasm when moving the men towards the American position. Howe did not begin his march to White Plains until October 28th. Howe's seemingly lethargic pace has opened up questions into his planning for that fall. Had Howe acted more aggressively, there was a non-zero chance that he might have been able to overrun and trap the American army. While we have talked about the reasons for his seemingly overcautious approach to the war, it also meant that the British missed out on critical opportunities where they may have been able to deal that fatal blow to the Continental Army and actually end the war. Of course, we know that did not happen. And in fact, as historian John Fairling points out, in the 60 days since Howe had landed on Long Island, his huge force had moved a grand total of just 35 miles. At what was really the last minute, Washington realized that he was facing a potential catastrophe, when it occurred to him that should Howe manage to capture Chatterton Hill on the west side of the line, he would set up artillery and blast the Americans to bits. Washington had put a few men there to anchor his line. However, it was limited to just a few hundred militia. Howe was not ignorant of this opportunity, and sure enough, moved directly towards the hill that Washington was now desperately trying to reinforce. The battle that did ensue there did not see either army really throw the bulk of their force into it. Both sides had a lot to lose and did not seem interested in the risk that making White Plains a decisive battle would entail. Unlike the previous battles, the Americans did hold their ground and did not immediately melt away. The combined British and German force took heavy losses as they made several attempts to take the hill. Ultimately, and as expected, the British would eventually capture the hill. Overall, though, it was a far better performance from the Americans than we have seen in some time. The British took their objective. However, the Americans did not make the victory easy. I've got several books that I'm looking at, and each book seems to have different numbers as to the casualties. But in general, they all seem to agree that the Americans had fewer casualties than the British. Though certainly it was not the lopsided numbers that we had seen at Bunker Hill. The British had won the day, and it was not a Pyrrhic victory by any means. However, for the Americans, they had conducted themselves well. Either way, casualty numbers appeared to be under 400 per side, regardless of the source. As the War of Posts continued, as the British captured Chatterton Hill, Washington made the call and pulled his army further to the north, to North Castle. Howe would again chase after Washington and capture his old lines at White Plains. However, he did not remain there for long. Shortly after making those lines, Howe decided to pull back in what Washington would, happily, declare as being a retreat. This had been a genuinely curious move for Washington, he was busy waiting for an attack. He was aware that the British were getting reinforcements, and that, in what had become the traditional and infuriating fashion, Howe was really just standing around, not doing anything. Washington spent the better part of 4 days stressing over the fact that an army that significantly outnumbered his own was making preparations for an assault on his position at North Castle. Yet, during those days, the British just sat there, doing a whole lot of nothing. Finally, on November 4th, the British did begin to move, though as mentioned a moment ago, it was not towards Washington's position, but rather back towards Manhattan. Washington was seemingly perplexed why the British were withdrawing. He wrote to Congress about the good news, though he admitted that he was a little bit lost as to why it was happening. Regardless, though, for the first time since Long Island, Washington's army was getting a much-needed moment to breathe. Our obvious question now is, much as Washington was trying to figure out, just what were the British up to? There was all kinds of speculation. Some believed that they were getting ready to attempt a speed run up the Hudson and cut the Americans off from the north. Others believed that the war was getting ready to shift from New York down to the south. Finally, others believed that the British were preparing to enter their winter quarters. Really, though, the major thing that was going around during the early part of November was rumors and confusion. Among the guesses, and the one that was ultimately correct, is that Howe is shifting his focus onto Fort Washington and Fort Lee, with his sights now set on an invasion of New Jersey, and subsequently a march on Philadelphia. Fort Washington was located back on Manhattan, just south of the Harlem River. If you are looking at a map, it was located roughly where the George Washington Bridge now sits. On the opposite bank across the Hudson was Fort Lee. The idea was that these two forts would provide the necessary defense for the Hudson, and would prevent the British from being able to get control over the river. It quickly became obvious to Washington that Fort Washington was indeed a likely potential target. On November 9th, Washington began moving troops from their position at North Castle Heights into New Jersey in preparation for Howe's invasion. Now, Washington was dealing with a substantial amount of uncertainty here, so he did not take the entire army. Instead, he chose to leave Charles Lee back at White Plains, along with some 7,000 men. He moved another 4,000 further up the Hudson to Peekskill. Finally, he took along another 2,000 with him to go to New Jersey, although he anticipated reinforcements bringing that number closer to 5,000. Before invading New Jersey, General Howe had to deal with Fort Washington. Here, he got lucky at the beginning of November, when William Demont decided that he was done with the American cause, jumped across to British lines, and provided Howe with a detailed overview of the fort's defenses. Yet, even without Demont's treason, much of the American leadership had concluded that Fort Washington, and subsequently Fort Lee, should simply be abandoned. After all, the British for some time had shown that they were quite adept at just sailing between the two forts to little consequence. Although it seems like Washington himself agreed that the forts probably were not worth the fight, he trusted the word of his commanding general of the fort, Nathanael Greene. Greene believed that there were several reasons that justified holding the fort. First, Greene believed that the fort was extremely defensible. The fort was protected on the west by a steep cliff down to the Hudson. This means that the Americans really only needed to worry about 3 sides of the fort. The fort's location on this cliff reminded Greene of Bunker Hill. He envisioned the British sending wave after wave up that hill as the Americans made its capture a bloodbath. Plus, even if things did go sideways, that position along the river would just allow the Americans to easily evacuate into New Jersey. Finally, the proponents for holding the fort viewed it as a check on the British. If they could maintain control over Fort Washington, it meant that Howe was going to have to waste precious resources holding Manhattan, rather than using those troops to overwhelm Washington and the rest of the Americans. To be sure, it is not as though Greene was alone in his advocating holding the fort. Charles Lee, for example, was at least initially a big proponent of holding the fort, although he would pretty quickly change his mind on the subject. Following the British pullback towards Manhattan, Washington showed more trepidation towards the defense of Fort Washington, telling Greene flat out that he did not think holding the fort was justified. It wasn't worth the risk. However, Washington failed to give a direct order to Greene, telling him to abandon the fort. And without such an order, Greene had no plans to give up his stronghold. If there was a moment in the war where Washington struggled in his role as the commander, it was right here. He clearly was uncomfortable with the risk of holding the fort, yet despite making this obvious, he failed to ever give the direct order. He clearly trusted Nathanael Greene. However, he placed that trust in his officer over his own better judgment. With Washington stuck in a loop of indecisiveness over what to do with the fort, he decided that he needed to get his eyes on the situation personally. George Washington always liked having the ability to personally take in a situation with his own eyes. We have seen this before, first at Long Island, and then again when Washington was very nearly captured as he rushed out towards Kip's Bay. The day before, November 15th, the fort's immediate commander, Colonel Robert Magaw, received a message from Howe. It was the standard demand to surrender. As we have done many times before, back during the French and Indian War, Magaw made those required statements of being willing to hold out until the last man. Even with those ultimatums, however, Washington still wanted to go to the fort and take in the situation himself. As he crossed the Hudson along with Greene, the British opened fire on the fort. Not one to back away, Washington and company sped across the Hudson so he could take in the entire scene. Along with Washington was Nathanael Greene, as well as Israel Putnam and Hugh Mercer. They were standing inside of a fort that the British were now actively working on putting under siege. I think it is fair to say that this was not the best place to be concentrating so much of the senior leadership. The other three men were cognizant of the fact that Washington was now in significant danger, and that the revolution depended on him not getting killed inside his namesake fort. Even before he left, Washington realized that it was a lost cause. There was no saving this fort. There was not even going to be the opportunity to pull those men out. Washington agreed to leave, convincing his generals that there was no reason to remain behind. He was not willing to risk so much of his senior officer corps for a catastrophe in the making. The men who had rowed over earlier in the day now turned and rowed back together, leaving Fort Washington and the 3,000 men still inside to their fate. As for the actual battle, as the smoke cleared, the British had actually suffered slightly higher casualty numbers. British casualties stood at right around 300 dead and injured, as compared to around 150 for the Americans. However, when you consider that the Americans saw over 2,850 men captured, the true scope of the battle comes into focus. Despite prior reassurances from Magaw that he could hold out until December, as well as his earlier boasting that he would fight to the last man. As it turns out, that resolve lasted only for about 3 hours before he surrendered the fort, the men, and the large store of supplies housed within. There is no question that George Washington was reeling. The loss at Fort Washington had been a complete disaster, and yet he hardly had a moment to stop and catch his breath. As soon as Fort Washington fell, the American position right across the river at Fort Lee became distressingly vulnerable. Sure enough, on November 20th, 4 days after the disaster at Fort Washington, Cornwallis and 4,000 men would cross the Hudson and march on the fort. Washington had caught wind of Cornwallis's intention and had little interest in waiting around to greet him. Although Washington had long been pushing his men to stay and fight, in this instance, the very last thing that he wanted was a battle. In the wake of the loss of both Fort Washington and Lee, the army was now at a low point. Morale was approaching rock bottom, and Washington must have feared that another major loss would have seen his army dissolve away. Thankfully for the Americans, Cornwallis seemed to be just about as disinterested in an engagement. For the next several weeks, what ensued was Washington falling continually back to the south and west, as Cornwallis pursued. Cornwallis, despite having some opportunities, never did make a decisive strike, because, unbeknownst to Washington, he was under orders from Howe not to get drawn into a major battle. The Americans and British did fight a small skirmish along the banks of the Raritan River on December 1st. A brief artillery battle ensued with Alexander Hamilton taking the command over the cannons. The battle itself was indecisive and produced little in the way of damage on either side, though it is noteworthy because of Hamilton's participation. Finally, on December 2nd, the Americans reached Trenton, and then 5 days later on the 7th, the Americans evacuated New Jersey entirely, crossing the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. The day following the American evacuation, the British would enter and capture Trenton. As Howe and Cornwallis pursued the Americans through New Jersey, Henry Clinton broke off and moved back towards Rhode Island. Arriving on December 7th, Clinton met with virtually no resistance when he landed off the coast of Newport. With Washington's army having crossed the Delaware into Pennsylvania, a general panic spread through Philadelphia. Once the river froze over that winter, the British could just march over and head into the capital. This had a major impact on how the war itself was being conducted. With Philadelphia now in danger, people, predictably, wanted to get out before the British army could march into town. Among those groups who knew that they needed to get out of the city were the delegates in Congress. Philadelphia could fall. However, the Congress surely could not allow itself to be captured. With the Congress itself needing to retreat, they handed over additional powers to Washington to allow him to better manage the war effort, rather than try to manage a war while themselves fleeing from the British. Although it was to be a power handed to Washington for just 6 months, it did, more or less, turn him into a de facto dictator during that time. We are going to leave Washington here for now, before coming back next week to wrap up the events of 1776. For the rest of today, I want to spend our time considering just what a disaster the past few months had been for the Americans. Really, if we are trying to find the low point for Washington as a commander, this was it. From the time that Howe had landed off of Staten Island, it had been just an ongoing set of disasters for the Americans. Washington could complain all he wanted, and probably to good reason, about the conduct of both the enlisted men and the officers, who more than often would go running when danger came. However, his leadership abilities must also come under the microscope here. George Washington had showed an unfortunate amount of vacillation and indecisiveness during that year's campaigns. We can point the finger at Nathanael Greene all we want, and trust me, Washington did not hesitate to do just that. However, Washington failed to give the order to evacuate. In New Jersey, Washington desperately needed men and was hoping that Charles Lee would send them. Washington informed Lee of his plight, but again, he failed to make the order. Washington was the commander-in-chief, and despite his avoidance on the matter, the call was his. During these months, there were murmurings, though importantly, it always remained murmurings, that maybe Washington was not the right guy for the job. Charles Lee had at least a few people looking in his direction and wondering what it would be like if Lee were to replace Washington. Lee had performed well down in South Carolina, where he had been the senior officer on the scene for Clinton's failed landing. Among Lee's supporters was Joseph Reed, whom Washington counted amongst one of his closest aides. When a letter between Lee and Reed, critical of Washington's performance, fell into his hands, it cut Washington deeply as he learned just how much his senior staff, including those members closest to him, were now doubting his abilities. Although Lee would not outright encourage such conversation, he also did nothing to stop it. It was more than just a few disgruntled congressmen and officers that painted the end of 1776 as being such a particularly bleak moment for the general. How George Washington handled the disaster at his namesake fort was less than ideal. Rather than accept the blame for the debacle, he deflected. What had happened in New York at Fort Washington was an event that Nathanael Greene had a share of the blame in. Really, he held the lion's share of it. Yet the truth remained that it was Washington and not Greene that held the ultimate authority on the matter. Washington had warned Greene of his concerns. He felt that trying to hold Fort Washington was a bad idea and even expressed surprise upon his own arrival to Fort Lee that Greene had not yet pulled out. Yet throughout all of this, it had been that indecisiveness by Washington that had kept him from giving the order that he clearly believed was correct. When it came time for Washington to explain what had happened at Fort Washington, he failed to mention his seeming paralysis towards making a decision. Instead, he pointed the finger at Greene, blaming him for bad advice. Washington would reluctantly take responsibility for what had happened, but he wanted to make sure that he justified exactly why he had made a bad decision. Of course, it is also impossible to exonerate Greene in the debacle at Fort Washington. Yet, at the same time that Washington was deflecting blame for what had happened, he did not actually relieve Greene of his command. Greene was not exactly what one would consider to be an experienced soldier. He had no prior experience. And yet, Washington seemed to like the young man. Yes, a mistake had been made, but Washington still saw Greene as a capable leader. However, while Washington seemed willing to keep Greene around, that did not stop others in the army from piling the blame on him. Henry Knox was about the last friend that Greene had left. As 1776 began to wind down, it is difficult to see the year as being anything but a failure for the Americans, and for Washington personally. It is important here to remember that we enjoy the benefit of hindsight. We know how the war is going to turn out. We know what George Washington's legacy is going to be. However, in 1776, nobody knew that Washington would end up with the moniker of Father of the Country. They did not know that the capital city would be named after him, nor that there would eventually be a state with his name on it. Nobody in 1776 knew that George Washington would end up being the most well-known American in history, nor that he would become this legendary figure for generations of Americans. In 1776, what they knew is that the war was going badly. They knew that Washington's indecisiveness was, at least partially, to blame for this state of affairs. Yet, if it feels that we are being overly harsh on Washington right now, we should also appreciate his successes for the year. Yes, he had taken some devastating losses. However, despite this, he had managed to keep an army in the field. Some of that was pure luck, the storm that delayed Admiral Howe from slipping behind him on Long Island, for instance. Regardless of a lucky bit of weather, though, it was Washington who was able to realize his predicament and organize what was truly a masterful evacuation. Although the battle was a loss, Washington managed to keep his men in the field. This is not much different from what he had done months earlier in Boston. When Washington had taken Dorchester Heights, he never ended up using that artillery that he had moved into place. In fact, his army never needed to fire a shot. The victory rather came in the very process of getting everything into place. The battle itself may have been non-existent. However, as a feat of logistics, it was a very impressive victory. If Washington had shortcomings as a commander when it came to indecisiveness, and occasionally coming up with overly complicated plans, his strength was his ability to hold his army together and to keep it in the field. As it would turn out, however, we are not ready just yet to wrap up 1776. Washington may have spent the last several months trying to get himself onto steadier footing and to stop the retreat. However, as it would turn out, he was not quite done himself with offensive missions for the year yet. Sure, Washington had just taken his army across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. But what would happen if he chose to cross back? Next time, we are going to answer that question and find out what would happen if the Americans decided to cross back across the Delaware. In one of the most dramatic moments of the war for the Americans, George Washington will make an attempt to deliver a blow to the British before everybody enters their winter camps. Until then, I hope you all have a wonderful 2 weeks. I hope that you are staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you back here next time as George Washington crosses the Delaware.